Rob Wittman is coming up. Now, let me tell you about Rob Wittman. You know him, Republican, 1st District, all that good stuff. Rob Wittman, the first Republican in a leadership position to call for a change at the Speaker's helm. I believe it was his call and his endorsement of Jason Chaffetz that started this whole thing going, and change is a good thing. And joining us now is Rob Wittman, Congressman, Republican, Chairman of the House Readiness Subcommittee. Chairman Wittman, good to have you with us, sir.
John, it's great to be with you this morning. Thanks for having me on.
Well, you're a rabble-rouser.
Yeah, well, occasionally you have to push the issue, and I think, leadership is an important thing for the Republican caucus, especially with all the things we have going on in the world today, the things we see happening in the executive branch. We need good, strong, direct leadership. We need a good communicator to communicate what we as a conference are going to stand for, the things that we're going to do. While I certainly respect Speaker Boehner's service, I do think it was the right time for him to move on. And while I do respect Kevin McCarthy, I thought that we needed a different direction and to make sure that we as a conference did some soul searching to determine what do we want as a conference, where are we going to go, how are we going to make sure that leadership for our conference is a bottom-up effort to make sure it's members that are driving the issues, to make sure that members, as they listen to folks back home, are bringing those ideas, and that those ideas are what come out of our conference and what we do in leading here in the House. That has to happen, John.
Well, Dr. Wittman, you're a subcommittee chairman. I mean, you're in leadership. So I'm just going to say this on the air. I mean, what you did took a lot of moxie. I just got to tell you straight up.
Well, I took some grief for it, but I believe that at those times you need to stand up, and it may not be the most popular thing to do, but it's the right thing to do. And I think that making sure that we as Republicans here determine what direction we're going to take, and to make sure that indeed we have the right leadership in place is critical. And that's what leadership's about. Sometimes you're there by yourself, but that's not a bad thing, because it does get other people to think. It does ask them, or it asks of themselves to question what they're there for and what needs to happen with both them individually and both for us as a conference.
Congressman Wittman, let's get to the Benghazi hearings yesterday. The narrative seems to be pre-written. Hillary Clinton wins. What did you make of the whole thing?
Well, I had maybe a little bit different perspective on it as far as whether Hillary Clinton won. I think that there were some very important points that came out of yesterday's hearing. First, John, is that it's clear that Secretary Clinton was less than forthcoming in what she knew and what she projected was the cause behind the attacks in Benghazi. As we see from yesterday's hearing, her personal communications indicated that she clearly identified those attacks coming from an al-Qaeda-like organization or other terrorist organizations there in the region, as she communicated to the president in Egypt. So that was counter to the dialogue that she had with the American public to say that it was based on the video. So I think that was a very, very defining moment for her testimony and what the American people should see out of that. I do believe, too, that another thing that should concern people is the effort that was made by Ambassador Stevens to communicate that there were security shortfalls there in Benghazi. As you heard one of our committee members yesterday, Mike Pompeo from Kansas, bring out, there were over 600 individual pieces of communications to the State Department saying there's a security issue here. We need to have this addressed. We need additional security. And for none of that to make its way to Secretary Clinton, and she talked about her quote-unquote security professionals. You notice she didn't identify any individual, nor was any individual ever held accountable for not providing the security that was asked for. She sidestepped that, didn't take responsibility for it, yet Sidney Blumenthal was able to clearly communicate with her on multiple occasions on issues involving Benghazi. So it seems counterintuitive to me that you're going to have somebody that doesn't work for the State Department, somebody that, in her words, was a friend and acquaintance, yet your ambassador your person on the front line in Libya. They're in Benghazi. They're in harm's way, multiple times identifying there's an issue here. We need additional security. There are risks here, risks that I'm identifying to you, and nothing happened. To me, if nothing else, you look at that and say, is that leadership? Is that somebody that's effectively performing there as Secretary of State? And this should not be a partisan issue. This should be, what is the truth? How do we judge the individuals that are put in those leadership positions as far as clearly projecting the truth of the matter, clearly projecting what they feel were the groups behind these attacks, clearly identifying that their responsibility is to make sure that they take care of our ambassadors in the State Department. And Secretary Clinton said, well, I had hundreds of ambassadors around the world. That is indeed correct. But you only had one ambassador in Libya that was in Benghazi, in a place that she knew was a high-risk consulate, was a place that deserved the State Department's attention, that she knew what was going on in that area of the world. So I think there were some very, very telling pieces of information that came out of yesterday's hearing that everybody should look at, regardless of their political persuasion, and say, is this really something that we should feel comfortable with? Is this something that we should believe should not continue to be looked at, and that we should believe somebody there should not be held accountable? I believe strongly, John, that accountability needs to occur here. And while Secretary Clinton is no longer Secretary of State, there's nobody in the State Department in one way, shape, or form has been held accountable for this. I think that speaks volumes. Secondly, too, is the integrity of Secretary Clinton in her performance of the job as Secretary of State. I think that that is significant, especially now since she is putting herself out there to run for President of the United States.
So, Congressman Wittman, really, I think you just nailed it. That's spot on. There were two issues, really, that came out. One of them dealing with all the requests for additional security that were not responded to or not honored. And so it becomes a question of either incompetence or politics. You didn't want to honor the request for the security because it didn't play in perhaps to the narrative of the Obama reelection campaign on the fact that they were saying they had al-Qaeda and other terrorists on the run. And then you got the other issue, which is Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, sends an email at 10:08 p.m. to her family saying, well, terrorist attack, and then tells the American people something else. So how do you elect somebody president that has already proven to you in crisis, as Jim Jordan said yesterday? He didn't use the word lie, but he said didn't come square. How do people reconcile that with somebody that is now asking to be their commander-in-chief?
Well, I think it's hard to square that. We are looking for somebody to lead this nation, to make sure that they are beyond reproach in their integrity and how they communicate, and not being less than trustworthy with that, and not, putting out information that's incorrect or misdirecting individuals for political purposes. I think all those things cut to the heart of what all of us should use as a metric to determine who the leader of the United States should be. And I think this does call into question, with her being less than forthright in how she communicated this, and even going back and saying, well, this is what the CIA told us. Well, to have her own judgment, and certainly information that she was receiving from people inside the State Department, and what came to her allegedly from the CIA, and which we know was formulated by writers there in the CIA. Leadership, John, is about standing up and going, whoa, wait a minute, this can't be correct. Other information there leads us to believe, and as she said to her family and to others, the president of Egypt, to say, no, this is not the case. True leadership is standing up and going, we can't put this forward as the reason behind this, because we have to square with the American people. We have to be direct, honest, and forthright about what she believes was the cause behind this as Secretary of State. That's what leadership is about. And at the very least, she should have spoke out when the administration was putting together the talking points and saying, well, wait a minute, this is not the case. How can we be putting this information out there if we know otherwise, or if she even felt otherwise, or if she believed otherwise? To me, that's what leadership is about, That's what you're looking for in somebody that's asking to be the President of the United States, is to have the fortitude to stop and say, this doesn't make sense. This cannot be correct. This doesn't square with what we believe happened there. Stop it. Don't put forward this narrative that ultimately proved to be incorrect and was politically motivated. That's what leadership is about. I think that's what calls into question the ability for Secretary Clinton to become the president.
Remember the day that Susan Rice, who was the ambassador of the UN at the time, that went on 5 television shows on Sunday peddling this, what we now know is a false narrative. They just made it up because it fit it was politically expedient for their Obama re-election campaign. But remember, on that day, they first asked Hillary Clinton to go on TV with that narrative, and she said that she had a headache, and so they had to trot Susan Rice out. I mean, now with these emails coming out, I mean, it was no doubt, Jim Jordan brought up, it was no doubt that Hillary Clinton was absolutely knew what went down there, that it was a terrorist attack. That's why I believe she didn't want to go on the Sunday talk shows. But isn't it infuriating to you, Congressman, that the mainstream media is almost working in conjunction with the Clintonites to protect her from any of this? Because all of the headlines today is what I opened with: Clinton wins. I mean, how does this happen?
Well, I think it doesn't address the substance of her testimony. If you look at what others try to project and saying, well, she was measured in her response. She didn't react in ways that we otherwise would have thought were unsuitable for this, like she had reacted to Senator Johnson's question before when she said, what difference does it make? I mean, that's certainly a metric that's very low as far as what we expect out of not only her as a leader, Secretary of State, but what you would expect out of her for president. That doesn't address what we believe, or what many folks, I think, look at as the important part of this testimony. It is the substance of the testimony, John, that should be at issue here. Again, you go back to the inconsistencies there. When she speaks to the prime ministers to the prime minister of Egypt and says, "This was, we believe, a terrorist attack associated with terrorist organizations." That's counter to what the message that came out of the White House on this. And again, I think that speaks to her leadership. So those things are lost in this. It was all about appearance versus substance. And I think the intent of this hearing was about getting at the substance of the issue, about what was behind Benghazi. The truth there does matter. The delivery is a sidebar of that. You can have the greatest delivery, but if the substance is of issue here, and the substance is what we have to question, and how she acted as a leader there, that's what I think gets missed with this. And if you know that there's a problem with the substance, and the only thing you can point to is the appearance or the delivery, then that, I think, speaks volumes about what Secretary Clinton had to say yesterday.
Dr. Wittman, let's get to Paul Ryan. I don't think I've ever seen somebody say, well, in order for me to have the job of speaker, I got to go home on the weekends. I got to leave on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. to go work out. I can only work so many hours a week. And by the way, I'll only become speaker if you pass this rule so that I can't be ousted. I mean, why are we even entertaining this?
Well, obviously there were some concerns with all of us as we heard those things came out. But I'll say this: in having the direct conversations with Paul, both in a group, with the Freedom Caucus, the Republican Study Committee, and then individually, Paul said clearly, he said, listen, I don't want to do away with the rule to vacate the chair. It's a valuable rule. It absolutely needs to be there. You need the mechanism to remove somebody in a position of leadership if they are not functioning properly or if there's malfeasance there. So he clarified that and said, listen, I don't want to remove that. He did want to align it with the same rules that we have for impeachment. So the other mechanisms that you have to remove people, there ought to be some parity there. So I think Paul brings up a good point there. And ultimately, it'll be up to the members of the House as to what those rules will be. So there wasn't a demand to say remove the rule. It was only to question, shouldn't we discuss it? And the Rules Committee, the Policy Committee will indeed be addressing that. Paul clarified too and said, listen, I do have a family. He's got young children from 10 to 13, critical ages. He said, listen, I need to spend some time with my family, certainly something that all of us with families have a deep caring about. What he was saying is that the number of hours and days that it takes traveling on the road to raise money would be something that he couldn't do as much of as the speaker. But he did say that he would focus his other time to make sure that he was a very good communicator about what our conference stood for, what we were doing, things that we knew were not being done previously. And I think it's important to make sure we have a good communicator there, that we are out there talking about what we stand for as Republicans, what we are going to do as a conference, how this makes sense in relationship to the problems that the nation has. And Paul clearly communicated that and said, listen, I think that's an important job. And he said pretty candidly, he said, listen, if I'm out trying to raise money on an effort that people don't believe in, he said, that's kind of a tough process to ask people to give to something that isn't clearly communicated or that people aren't believing we're doing the right thing. He said, my job is to make sure that we as Republicans are clearly communicating that we're doing the right things, that we are clearly taking this nation in the right direction. He said, and then the ability to get people to contribute based on what we're doing becomes much, much easier. And then he can ask other people as part of the team that we have on leadership here to be part of that. So I think he's correct in saying we've got to get the cart before the horse. We've got to make sure we're doing the right things. We have good, effective communication about what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, why it's the right direction for the nation. And those other pieces follow in behind that. So he's not saying that he's not willing to work hard. He's not willing to do the things that are necessary. He's saying that we have to do things in the right sequence, and that he does need to spend some time with his family, which I think everybody here can identify with, and that the time demands for this job were significant. As you know, Speaker Boehner there spent over 200 days outside of Washington, traveling around the country, raising money. But it's still a challenge to raise money if people don't believe in what you're doing. If you get that going first and saying, yes, the direction is proper, we do believe in what the Republicans are doing, then the effort to raise resources gets to be simpler and easier. So I think Paul does have the elements right. I think he's willing to work hard to do those things. And I think that hearing that from him, from many of us here, reassures us that he has the right intent in mind.
Well, Dr. Wittman, look, we're all dads, and we get the dad thing. You get it. I get it. I'm a dad. I've got an 11-year-old at home. We all get that. But here we've got Paul Ryan running around now saying, look, I'm not going to be able to go out like Boehner and raise money for 200 days, but I'm going to be the great communicator of the party. Here's the reality, Dr. Wittman. I'm going to just say it straight out. This guy was a disaster as a vice presidential candidate. He had a debate with Joe Biden. Joe Biden wiped the floor with him and then mocked them in the debate. He was that bad. He didn't get one extra vote for Mitt Romney. He didn't get a state. He was a terrible communicator. Now all of a sudden he's going to be the savior of the Republican message. I don't see it.
Well, John, I don't think anybody claims that Paul's going to be the savior. I think going into the speakership is probably the most unenviable role that you could assume here in Washington. If it was a great spot to be in, you'd see people lining up to do it. It is a tremendously difficult, bordering on torturous job to be able to come in and do that. There's so many expectations out there. There are divisions, obviously, across the public. There are divisions within our party. I do think he comes in with the right attitude and saying, listen, my job is to work to bring people together to get things done based on good, common-sense, conservative principles. It is certainly an unenviable job. It is a extraordinarily difficult job. And Paul, in running for vice president, I think did go around and did do a good job in addressing issues concerning the deficit, the debt, budget issues, those areas that he's very adept at, as well as putting out some plans about the things that we could do to address issues such as how do we repeal Obamacare and put our Republican principles in place to replace that. Those are the things that have to be communicated, and I think Paul has the ability to do that. If you look at the folks that have put themselves out there, Dan Webster and Paul Ryan, I think, to me, it's clear in the choice between those two. And folks have mentioned, well, you need to have somebody other than somebody in Congress, and there's hundreds of other names that have been listed.
Well, that's not going to happen.
I know that.
Dr. Wittman, I'm almost out of time.
Sure.
I want Rob Wittman for Speaker. That's who I want.
Well,
I want Wittman for Speaker. I'm going to start my own. I'm going to start my own draft Wittman for Speaker today.